Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us for today's Antiquity program. We are delighted today to welcome Dr. Runen Naiard, who is Assistant Professor of Ancient Egyptian Art and Archaeology here at Emory. He joined the faculty in 2018, coming to Emory after teaching at the University of Copenhagen, where he also earned his PhD, and also at Christ College, Cambridge. He is a specialist in ancient Egyptian funerary culture and is the author of Concepts in Middle Kingdom Funerary Culture, published in 2019 by Brill, among other works. Today, he is going to talk to us about a fascinating letter to the dead in the Michael C. Carlos Museum. And he's done some very interesting research on this and has some new thoughts he will share with us. So go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A, and at the end of Dr. Naiard's presentation, I will ask him those questions live and he can answer live. So thank you so much for being with us today, Dr. Naiard.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here. There we go. In the first half of the 21st century BCE, somewhere in Upper Egypt, most likely at the site of Naghae Dir, a woman called Mary Tifi was ill. She held a position of some importance in the cult of her ancestress Nebet-Itef, and in return for dutifully performing the rituals of the cult, she could expect, as you generally would as participant in the ancient Egyptian ancestor cult, to enjoy the ancestors' blessing and protection from beyond the grave. However, the fact that Mary Tifi was nonetheless ill seemed to indicate that that protection was not forthcoming. And for that reason, the family decided to approach the ancestress with a formalized written petition of the kind that Egyptologists tend to refer to as letters to the dead. Now, at Naghae Dir, the most common approach would have been to write such a petition on papyrus, whereas at other sites, ceramics, the pottery vessels used for the offering cult seem to have been the chosen medium. However, Mary Tifi, along with the brother of the deceased, Khu'au, made the unusual decision to write the letter instead on the reverse side of a gravestone that formed the focus of the ancestor cult for Nebet-Itef. It's even possible, although by no means certain, that the stone slab was made specially to carry this message to Nebet-Itef on the other side of the grave. In the letter, the two petitioners state their case, and Mary Tifi, in addition, asks the ancestress to show herself in a dream in order to confirm her blessing and the efforts to heal Mary Tifi. Our second vignette takes place some 4,000 years later in Cairo in 1958. Here, the American scholar Edward Wente, whom we see on the right here, at the time was a PhD student about to finish his dissertation on the syntax of verbs of motion in Egyptian. And as it happens, he found himself in the Antiquities Museum in Cairo at the same time as an antiquities dealer who was clearing a collection of objects for export according to the procedure at the time. Among the objects that Wente thus saw, he noticed a small limestone stela that very unusually had a hieratic text written on the back. The dealer would not divulge the identity of the purchaser, but he did intimate that it was going to be exported to the United States. Unfortunately, Wente was not carrying a camera at the time, but the dealer allowed him to make a quick copy and transcription of the letter, which was intended in the first instance really just to help in tracking down and identifying the new whereabouts of the stela upon Wente's return to the United States. However, when he did return, his efforts to locate the stela turned out to be in vain. And some 16 years later, Wente decided that given those circumstances, it would be worthwhile to publish his rapid notes that he had made just to make sure that the stela became known to a wider scholarly audience. This meant that Wente's transcription and the very short verbal description of the stela that he published as he remembered it 16 years after having actually seen the stela was the only form in which Egyptologists knew of this, this letter and this stela for several decades. Nonetheless, the text became quite famous and frequently cited as evidence of the otherwise expected but not clearly attested or articulated phenomenon that deceased ancestors could appear to their descendants in dreams in order to convey their blessings. Incidentally, this was also the form in which I myself drew on this text in my dissertation over a decade ago, which explored, among other things, the experiential aspects of the ancient Egyptian mortuary cult. So we have here on the slide the description that Wente provides, a limestone stela or tablet about 1 foot high, as I recollect, on the front of which was a painted scene of a man making an offering, while on the reverse side was an ink inscription of 7 vertical lines in the hieratic script of the first intermediate period. So whereas as he gives a detailed transcription of the text that allowed scholars to translate and discuss various translation possibilities, the only knowledge of the images of the stela is this very brief text that we have a painted scene of a man making an offering, and in addition to being brief, it is also the recollection that Wente had after actually seeing the stela briefly 16 years previously. So the physical stela was eventually reconnected to this somewhat disembodied presence in the academic discourse when Egyptologist Edmund Meltzer identified the stela as a recent acquisition by the Hera Family Trust and presented that find at the annual meeting of the American Research Center in Egypt in 2008. In the meantime, the stela has very fortunately become part of the Michael C. Carlos Museum's collection, and it's exhibited prominently in the Egyptian galleries. So if we turn to look at the stela, we can see that the majority of the surface of the stela is taken up by inscriptions, and we have the image in the middle here of not as Wente recollected a man making an offering, but rather a woman who holds something in her hand here, which, based on parallels, is certainly a lily or lotus flower that she would be holding up before her face, and in her other hand she has an ankh. Now, as I've indicated, we can't really fault Wente for not giving an accurate description. It was clearly not the center of his interest either when he first examined the stela or when he published the text. And there was a long time span in between that will easily account for a slightly fuzzy recollection of what was actually depicted on the stela, but the identification, as we'll see, of the stela owner as a man, although it's been recognized as being erroneous since Edmund Meltzer rediscovered the stela, still had some ramifications for the understanding of the piece as a whole and for the identity of the writer of the letter that turned out to be questionable. So this is one of the things that I would like to explore today. If we look at the inscriptions on the stela, then we are dealing with 3 so-called offering formulae, which associate the mortuary cult of the owner of the stela with different gods. So on the right here, we have an offering formula dedicated to Osiris, the Lord of Jeddu, the foremost of the Westerners, Lord of Abiders, and then an invocation offering, which is the technical term for the offering being given in front of the stela in the mortuary cult. The text then continues in the horizontal line down here, 1,000 bread and beer, oxen, gazelles, and fowl, which is the contents of the offerings that are going to be brought before the stela. On the left side, we have a similar offering formula. This one is dedicated to Anubis, the lord of Separ, and another important cult place. And we have a wish for a perfect burial for the endowed one before Hathor, Nebet Itef, born by Inet Kau. So this is the mother's name. And up here, we have just enough to see that there would have been an additional offering formula. We can see that from the remains of signs up here. And from the very faint traces on the left here, we actually have enough to identify what we would have had up here, because these expressions are so formulaic. So this would have been another offering formula, this one devoted to another form of Anubis, in this case Anubis, who is on his mountain, associating him with the Western Mountain and hence the necropolis and the realm of the dead. Incidentally, it's extremely rare to have three offering formulae like this juxtaposed on a single stela. I know of a single other example from this period, whereas on coffins from the Old Kingdom and throughout the Middle Kingdom, it's very common to have this exact combination of three offering formulae written on different sides of the coffin. So we'll return to this question later, but it's worth bearing in mind that we're beginning to see some similarities between this the stela and the decoration of coffins, whereas comparing it to other stelae shows this to be a quite unusual piece. So as we can see that there should in principle be some be good reasons for trying to reconnect the decoration on the front of the stela, which has played little to no role in the interpretations of the letter so far. And I would like to focus today on two particular questions. On the one hand, the provenience and date of the stela. So where does it come from, and how old is it? I've already indicated in my beginning vignette what I think is going to be the answer to this, but I'd like to talk a bit about how one may arrive at that conclusion and the kind of considerations that go into that. And then the other question that I would like to focus on today is the identity of the writers of the letter. We'll dive into the question of why that is still an open question, given that the letter itself has been known for quite some time. So if we begin by looking at where and when the stela is from, as Wendy already indicated just from having a quick look, it's quite clear from the style of the piece that it is, and also from the style of the writing, the handwriting on the reverse side, that this is from the first intermediate period. In other words, the time between the Old Kingdom and the Middle Kingdom, when rulers in Heracleopolis in the north and rulers in Thebes in the south were vying for control over Egypt, and both groups styled themselves as kings. So if we look at possible parallels to the stela, of course, given the way it has come to the knowledge of modern scholars, that is to say through an antiquities dealer, that we probably would no longer be able to identify if indeed he's still around. Our best bet at finding out where the stela might have come from would be to find something very similar, a very similar piece that for which we know the provenience. Now, unfortunately, and as I've already intimated, the stela of Nebeditev is quite unusual in a number of respects, and if we look around for things that are very similar to it, we come up without any tangible results. So the next best thing will be to examine the individual elements, especially elements that are special or unusual in one way or another, and see if we can find, even if it's not in pieces that look very much like the stela of Nebeditev, we may be able to find individual details that are characteristic for a particular time and place. One such detail is found in the lotus flower that well, the top of it is missing, but images like the stela here on the left provide quite close parallels, not only to the single female stela owner being depicted alone, but also to the strangely elongated stalk of the lotus flower held in the left hand of the figure. So these are quite close parallels. We also find stylistically less closely related, but still parallels in terms of iconography. That is to say, the meaningful elements of which the image is made up. So although stylistically this image on the right does not look a whole lot like the stela of Nebeditev, we can identify the pictorial elements of the ankh, the sign of life, being carried in the right hand, and the long-stalked lotus flower, although in this case the stalk is completely straight and vertical, and it's only the flower that bends, making the execution quite different. But the motif of a woman holding a lotus flower is quite similar to this scene, which comes from the Theban ruling family and the shrines at Thebes from the late First Intermediate period. Speaking of the Ankh sign, one thing that becomes apparent when we compare it to other potential parallels is that by far the most usual way to hold an Ankh sign in your hand is to put the hand through the loop, which is actually the Ankh sign has quite a convenient shape for being carried in the hand, but slightly unusually we have, well, actually very unusually, we have the Ankh sign sort of hovering right under the hand. But again, this is something that we find parallels for in the First Intermediate period stelae from Nagaid Dir. In this case, we once again have the bend left hand, but we don't have the long stalk of the lotus flower, so it's more likely that the destroyed object here was a mirror, which is something that we also quite often see female stela owners holding up before their face in a gesture similar to the holding of the lotus flower. Apart from that, and again, I won't go into all the details of this kind that one could potentially explore, but I wanted to show some of the some of the things that we're looking for when we are trying to track down the origin of a particular piece. And one of the things that are quite unusual in works from the first intermediate period Naga Idea, although it does show up sporadically in other places, is the combination of, or rather the addition of a gazelle within the conventional offering formula. So bread, beer, ox, and fowl are completely regular things that more or less ubiquitously show up in offering formulae, but the inclusion of a gazelle is quite distinctive, and thus is something else that we can go looking for parallels to, especially when pieces that show the gazelle in the offering formula additionally have other connecting points to our stela. So again, to take a couple of examples, here's a stela from Naga Idea, where we have the offering formula, in this case written horizontally above the scene rather than below it, but otherwise conceived quite similarly. And if we magnify this detail here, then we can see that once again we have ox, a gazelle, and fowl. Now the gazelle head here is perhaps not the most distinctive, but the iconographic detail of the forward curving horn is very characteristic of the iconography of the gazelle. So even if the head is executed in a way that doesn't distinguish it very clearly from the ox head, then the shape of the horn connects it to what we had in the Carlos Museum stela. Similarly, though, just to show that this is not only something that we find at Naga Idea, here we have an example that is a bit earlier and from the site of Dendera, the neighboring site of Dendera, a bit up the river. We find the same group here with 1,000 ox, fowl, and gazelle. In this case, they're accompanied by another horned animal, which is no doubt an oryx in this case. So the offering list can be augmented, but the very fact of adding a gazelle, and again we see the slight forward curve in the horns identifying it as such, is quite distinctive. And as it happens, the group of objects from Dendera, Fallstore and stelae from Dendera that show these connections are have a number of other commonalities in terms of iconography and inscriptions that connect them to pieces at Naga Idea. So there seems to have been some kind of connection, the exact nature of which we can't pin down, whether it's artists moving from one site to the other, or there being some other sort of interaction or inspiration between the two sites that are quite close to each other. But in any case, the stela of Nebeditev seems to be connected in a few other ways, not just the gazelle head that I've decided to use as example here, but there are a couple of other connections to this group of artworks that span those two sites. So once again, it affirms the idea that the stela of Nebeditev seems to belong within that sphere somewhere between those two localities, and with a preponderance of connections to the site of Naga Idea. Here's another example, and I think this is one of the last examples I'm showing of the details of science and iconography. So here we have the hieroglyph for Hathor. It's quite badly faded, but one of the characteristic things about the hieroglyph for Hathor is that it is a square with a falcon inside it. Literally, Hathor translates to the house of Horus. So it's a combination of a house hieroglyph with the falcon, the hieroglyph for the god Horus. Now, the house hieroglyph has a little square inside it in one of the corners, sometimes more than one of the corners, but usually just one of the corners. And the obvious choice for that corner is the corner back here, where we have where there's room for having the square. But in fact, we see it. We can just make out the details here in the magnified version, that we can see that the square has been placed here in the corner where the head of the falcon is, rather than back here in the far corner where there's actually room for it. And because that's quite an impractical arrangement, it's also a very unusual arrangement. And once again, the one example that I know of this particular arrangement of the square being located in the corner near the falcon's head comes from Nagaid Dir. So finally, I want to return to the connections between this stela and coffins that I had noted previously, and we see here a quite distinctive, and I realize many of you will have to take my word for that, quite distinctive form of the harpoon hieroglyph that's used in the verb bury. And if we look for parallels to this particular form, then we don't find any on stelae, but we find some relatively close parallels on coffins from the late First Intermediate period at Nagaid Dir. So if we turn to coffins, this is one of a small group of coffins from the late First Intermediate period that shows a number of different connections to sign forms that we find on the stela of Nebet-Itef. So you may recognize the harpoon here with the two prongs. That's quite similar. This sign is also similar to forms on the Nebet-Itef stela, and so is this. And then here's another coffin from the same, again from Nagaid Dir, and the same place. And we once again we see several distinctive sign forms that are reminiscent of forms that we find in the stela of Nebet-Itef. So to conclude this part of the discussion, it seems very likely on the basis of the kind of arguments that I have given a few examples of here, that the stela does in fact come from the site of Nagaid Dir, and that it would thus have come in principle from one of the small shrines of the type that are photographed here, where the stelae are embedded into the wall and serve as a connecting point for the ancestor cult, as we noted in the beginning. Now there can't be any final proof, and there are a few details that could potentially point in other directions, but the preponderance of evidence certainly points to Nagaid Dir and to a date in the quite late First Intermediate period. The similarity to the coffins brings me back to a point that I mentioned earlier, namely that one distinctive thing about the stela of Nebet-Itef is that, unlike the vast majority of stelae from Nagaid Dir, it's not carved in relief and then painted. It doesn't even have any incisions. It's painted directly onto the smooth surface of the limestone slab. And that in itself is a technique that is more similar to the painting of a coffin than to the carving of a stela. And so I would tentatively suggest that because of the connections to the sign forms of roughly contemporary coffins, and because those connections are in many cases closer than connections to contemporary stelae, we may even imagine that the painter of the stela of Nebeditev was actually a coffin painter rather than a stela maker, although that should be it's well, for one thing, it's pure conjecture, and another important point to bear in mind is that for some of these pieces, it's been argued quite cogently that it's actually the same artists that are responsible for making both the stela and the coffin of a given individual, so that there may not be as neat a distinction between the two groups as we might imagine. But if the stela was painted by a coffin painter, perhaps that might also give part of the explanation why some inspiration, such as the inclusion of the gazelle head and other connections with that slightly earlier group of stelae from Nagaidea and Dendera, might be drawn upon for inspiration rather than more contemporary practices of stela making from the likely date of the stela of Nebeditev. So, having broadly located the stela in time and space, let's turn to the letter that's written on the back of the stela and have a conversation about who might be the writer, because one of the things that is problematic is that whereas quite often in Egyptian letters you conveniently begin with a phrase like a mother writes to her son, so that we immediately know the relationship between the parties, and in fact that's what we get in the second part of the letter that we can see here on the right, a message from Huau to his sister. So that immediately pins down the well, sort of, because the terminology is quite broad, as it turns out in Egyptian, but still it gives us a sense of the relationship between the writer and recipient of the letter. However, the main writer simply introduces herself as a message from Meriot Tifi to Nebeditev. And then we read, "How are you? Is the West welcoming you just as you desire? Look, I am your beloved on earth, so fight on my behalf, intercede on behalf of my name. I have not garbled a recitation before you when perpetuating your name on earth. Drive out my body's illness, and then become manifest as an ach for me," that is to say, an ancestor spirit, "before," or something like that, "my face, so that I may see you fighting on my behalf in a dream. I will present offerings to you as soon as the sun has risen, and I will furnish the offering stone for you." And then appended to that is a message from Huau to his sister, the implication being that Huau is the brother of Nebeditev, although in practice the word that is used here in Egyptian has quite a wide range of references to a number of people, even of different generations, who are not in direct line of ascent or descent to the person to whom the kinship term refers. So in practice, a sister here could also be an aunt or a nephew, apart from being a sister. It can even, although that's mainly a later usage, it can even be used as a reference to someone's partner, spouse, and so on. Often there's something in the context that indicates which of these usages are pertinent in a given case, since as you can imagine, otherwise we could have a great deal of confusion when Egyptians talk amongst themselves. So when we just have a message from Huau to his sister, it's a reasonable supposition that it is actually his sister. He says, "I have not garbled a recitation before you, nor have I detracted offerings from you. Rather, I have procured," and this is then one of the unfortunate breaks in the text, "fight on my behalf, fight on behalf of my wife and children." So This letter contains many of the details of the vignette that I introduced the talk with, of the case of Mary O'Tiffy's illness and her turning to the ancestor Nebet-Itef to request help. But Mary O'Tiffy is not identified further in the text. And so a number of details, even the gender of Mary O'Tiffy remains open. And as we'll see in a minute, Wente had a strong sense that Mary O'Tiffy was a man, was the husband of Nebet-Itef, and that has remained the interpretation of this text in the vast majority of the literature ever since, for reasons that we will explore in a minute. So if we turn to the question of who wrote the letter, then we see immediately the problem that Mary O'Tiffy is not identified. We just read a message from Mary O'Tiffy to Nebet-Itef. Now, as you may recall, Wente in his brief description of the stela noted that the stela had on its front a man making an offering. As we also saw when we examined the stela and in our visual description of the stela, we concluded that actually both of those details turned out to be incorrect. It's not a man, and the person depicted on the stela does not give an offering. However, as we can see in the quote from Wente here, that identification underlies his interpretation of who wrote the stela. So he says, although the two other examples of this name, that is to say Mary O'Tiffy, known to me are feminine, the representation on the face of the stela is that of a man offering, and I'm inclined to believe that the writer of the letter was a widower. In line 3, the writer speaks of perpetuating the deceased's name, a ritual normally performed by men. So if we look at this, then he begins by talking about the name. Many Egyptian names, by no means all, but many names are specific to either one gender or the other. However, there's also a fairly large group of names, as in other languages, that can apply to either gender. So he notes that he has found two other examples that are Mary O'Tiffy's, which are women, but that's not necessarily conclusive. It may well be a name that could be used for either gender, as I mentioned. There are quite a few of those in Egyptian. Then he goes on to argue that the representation on the face of the stela is that of a man offering, and that is why he's inclined to believe that the writer of the letter was a widower. So that rests on the assumption that the man depicted on the stela is the same as the writer of the letter. So that in the first instance, that would only be true if the stela had been made at the same time as the letter had been written. Otherwise, there's no reason why that there shouldn't be one person depicted on the stela. And another person comes along and writes a letter. However, as it turns out, that discussion actually is a moot point, because the person depicted, as we saw, is the recipient of offerings, and thus, without a doubt, a representation of the stela owner, Nebet-Itef, to whom the texts on the front are dedicated and to whom the letters on the back are addressed, so that the gender of the figure represented on the front of the stela has no bearing on our identification of Mary O'Tiffy. That leaves the last argument, that in line 3, the writer speaks of perpetuating the deceased's name, a ritual normally performed by men. Now that's true, that it is indeed normally performed by men. So if we had other strong reasons to believe that the writer was a man, that might in principle, that argument might in principle have some weight there. But in fact, we also quite often find women carrying out that that very ritual of perpetuating the deceased's name. So that's another argument that turns out to be inconclusive if we are not already convinced, as Wente was, that the writer is a man. It's possible to find. I've been trawling through the literature and the representations, and it's possible to add a few more examples of Meriotifes, that is to say, the other occurrences of the name, other people being named that way. And the other two examples I've been able to find are also both of women. So we now have a total of 4 Meriotifes who are women, in addition to the writer of the letter to Nebedita, who may or may not be a woman, but certainly that shifts the preponderance towards the writer of the letter to Nebedita also being a woman considerably, especially since the reason for thinking she's a man has largely fallen away, as we've just seen. So we have a few additional clues to Meriotifes' identity. She says, "Look, I am your beloved on earth." She says, "I have not garbled a recitation before you in perpetuating your name on earth." And finally, "I will present offerings to you as soon as the sun has risen, and I will furnish the offering stone for you." So these are the relationships that we see between Meriotife and Nebeditef. The fact that Meriotife identifies herself as the beloved of Nebeditef is a bit more conclusive in Egyptian than it is in English. And I will spare you the philological details of the considerations here, but I think it's safe to say that the way the word is written, if that was taken outside of the context, any Egyptologist would immediately interpret that as a feminine participle, that is to say, referring to a female beloved. Whereas, as we just saw, Wente was convinced that the writer of the letter had to be a man, and for that reason he makes an argument that draws on a grammatical phenomenon that's attested only several hundred years later. In itself, that philological argument is quite weak, and it's definitely not the most obvious way to interpret the text. However, if he had already established by other means that the writer was a man, and recall that until the stela was rediscovered, we only had his word for what was represented on the front side. And if that indeed had been a man making offerings, then there would be a considerably better argument for trying to improve the text in the direction of making the writer a male writer. But in fact, this, as it turns out, this is another element that points towards a female writer of the letter. So if we look at the conclusions that we can draw from this, we have the name and the designation as beloved as things that are both pointing towards her being a woman, whereas we really don't have anything left that would point towards her being a man. We can also tell that Meriotife is a close relation of Nebeditef because of the large degree of responsibility for the cult, even over and above Nebeditef's brother, who writes the second shorter letter at the end. And because Meriotife has this responsibility in the cult, and also actually because of the use of the word beloved, which, unlike in English, where that word tends to be reciprocal, in an ideal case anyway, in Egyptian there's a strong tendency for when you say that you love someone, it's usually someone who is below you in the hierarchy for whatever reason. So the gods may love a king, a master may love his servant, A parent will love his or her offspring, but very rarely the other way around. So we will very rarely have the expression that a son loves his parents. Other words are used to express that relation. So when Mary Teefy says, "I am your beloved on earth," that would tend to indicate someone who is lower in the hierarchy, and because Mary Teefy at the same time has these central responsibilities in the cult, on balance, the most likely scenario, putting everything together, is that Mary Teefy is Nebet-Itef's daughter. But there are certainly other possibilities. She might be a sister. She might even be the mother of Nebet-Itef, although we would then have some problems with the meaning of beloved, and it would be an unusual situation. It's possible that Mary Teefy is not a woman. We don't have any final proof that Mary Teefy is a woman. But if she were a man, there's nothing in the letter to indicate Wence's scenario that Mary Teefy is the husband of the recipient. So that if we were to identify Mary Teefy as a man, then the most likely scenario would be that he would be a son, again because of the centrality in the cult and because of his designation as being beloved. So at the end, I want to just briefly contextualize the letter of Nebet-Itef within the larger corpus of letters to the dead. Here's an overview of letters to the dead attested from the Old Kingdom through to the Middle Kingdom. And as you can see, when the topics of the requests that the writers of the letters make are standardized, it turns out that there's a fairly small field of possible things that you would make these ritualized, formalized, written petitions to your ancestors for. One topic that comes up a fair bit is that of inheritance. In particular, there is an understanding that the ancestor will be interested in making sure that that his or her inheritance is passed on in the proper way, which usually, of course, is the way that the ancestor wanted, but may also just be the proper customary and or legal way according to the interpretation of the surviving relatives who write the letter. Then we get, as in our case, requests for aid and protection, sometimes specifically against illness, sometimes specifically against other dead. So there's a whole potential tension between the dead, where some may be hostile, and you then need to enlist the aid of your own ancestors, who are hopefully more powerful than the ones who are haunting you. So you get this potential competition, and one way to enlist the aid of your ancestors, if they're not already helping, is to write a petition of this type. Then we get a smaller number of requests that deal with fertility and reproduction, which is also a domain that the ancestors were seen as being responsible for. So you can approach the ancestors in order to request fertility, to request childbirth, as it's often worded. After roughly the mid second millennium, the practice of writing these petitions seems to be on the decline, possibly in tandem with a general development according to which ancient Egyptians became more likely to approach the gods and temples for aid than approaching their ancestors, which is something we see expressed in various different ways. as we move from the Middle Kingdom and into the New Kingdom. But certainly the number of attested letters to the dead drops significantly. A few examples at the end before I wrap up. I just wanted to briefly mention that most of the letters to the dead, like the letter to Nebet-Itef, are without an archaeological provenience. The only exception is this bowl here, which was found at Kau, where we know that it was in fact deposited in the tomb chamber from these rather cursory notes by Brunton. This circle here indicates the inscribed dish, as you can see, which is the bowl we just looked at. Interestingly, the letter on the bowl is addressed to two deceased, the mother and father of the writer of the letter, but there's only one man buried in the tomb, which has led to a recent suggestion that this is actually neither the father nor the mother, but it is the brother who is the main person that the writer of the letter complains about. So he may have been enlisted possibly against his will, as it might be, to carry this letter into the beyond, if that interpretation is correct. Of course, there are quite a few different possibilities of identifying that skeleton. I think I'll pass over this briefly. These are just examples, and we want to leave a bit of time for Q&A afterwards. Here's an example of a request for fertility. Also cause that a healthy male child be born to me. You are an able spirit, and I would further ask for another healthy male child for your daughter. And then finally, an example that has a connection to the stela of Nebet-Itef, in that there is talk of the dead appearing in dreams, but in this case the dream appearance is not a sign of a blessing, but rather of a haunting. So we have here a letter reading, excellent is attention to him who makes funerary provision for you. That's to say the writer of the letter, about this which your servant Seni does, namely causing yours truly to see him in a dream in one city together with you. So Seni is dead, and it seems between the lines that the writer of the letter may have had something to do with that, perhaps more than he cares to admit. But in any case, Seni is now haunting the writer of the letter. So he is approaching Henny's dead master and asking him, please may his Lord be protective and do not allow him to do harm. May he be guarded so that he no longer sees this servant ever again. So and we've learned that the way that he sees him is by appearing to him in a dream. So there's a reciprocal gaze where the living is seeing the dead and the dead is seeing the living. So to sum up, although the letter on the stela of Nebet-Itef thus belongs in a well-attested category of ancient Egyptian texts, it's also clear that each of these texts is deeply personal and fraught with important emotional topics that would have had great meaning in the lives of the makers of these texts, and potentially in this case also the artwork on the other side of the stela. So we have questions of illness, of haunting, anxieties over inheritance, and all of this is something that these texts give us an insight into that we otherwise might have been able to imagine, but certainly wouldn't have been able to pin down in the concrete way that we can derive from looking at the text and the objects they're written on. So with that, I want to thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Rune, for that. We do have some time for just a few questions, and there are some interesting ones about the word garbled. You know, what happened if it was garbled? It seems like an important issue, the not to garble the blessing. So what happens if it's garbled?
That's an excellent question, and as one might expect, we always see it expressed in the negative. The verb in itself means to mix up. You use it, for instance, when you're mixing ingredients for a healing remedy. So it means putting one thing in place of the other, mixing it up, messing it up. And what we can say is that would have reduced the efficacy of the rituals, and would mean that the ancestor had not been effectively summoned in order to partake of the offerings. So it's mentioned, as we saw in the letter, on a par with diminishing the offerings or otherwise doing things that are inappropriate. And it's not clear that the Egyptians necessarily had a specific idea about what would happen, other than you weren't meant to do that, and you were meant to carry out the ritual both as a sign of your respect, but also as a sign, or as a course for the ritual efficacy of the ancestor rituals.
And I realize that you may not know this, but several people have asked about the journey that this piece made from Egypt to the Carlos collection. And
yes, I think you may be better placed to speak to this than I am. It was here when I arrived, so I don't know the more of the details, but perhaps you do, and if so, please do.
Actually, I'm afraid that I don't. I know it was a gift to the museum by two fabulous collectors, Yoke Bolan and Piyush Patel, but I don't know more about that. And I think Melinda, our curator, who would know more, had to jump off. So we will try to get more of that information. I apologize that I know about its being a gift to the museum. Another question has to do with the names of Nebutit and Nebutitef. Are these common names in ancient Egypt?
Yes, they're quite common, and in fact, it's the exact same name that's also found on the coffin in the Carlos gallery. Sometimes it's transliterated Nebutitef, and sometimes it's transliterated Nebutit, for reasons that we probably don't have time to go into now. But it's the same name. So if we read one. If we read the name on the stela as Nebutitef, we could do the same thing for the coffin. Or if we argue Nebutit is the better reading, then that would also go for both of them. They are fairly common names, unlike Meriotifi, which is as I mentioned is a very rare name. Nebutitef is a fairly common name.
And then the last question is the purpose and the function of the offering formulas, and what were their function, and how did they relate more broadly to the theme of death in ancient Egypt?
Well, that's a very good question. So the original wording is an offering which the king gives, and the idea was that the king gave offerings to the gods, and the dead then would be able to partake in those offerings. Through the offering formula that gave them the right to do so by being connected to the cult of a particular god. Now, by this time, by the late First Intermediate period, that system was probably no longer in effect, and the offering formula had become more of a way to relate in general to a particular cult and be embedded in a relationship to particular gods. So they may or may not have had a more specific role in terms of the offerings and in terms of the way the cult was carried out, the people who were responsible for it, and so on, in ways that we can't quite see. But the offering formula continues all the way through Egyptian history, and it's quite clear that the reality that may originally have lain behind it, namely that the offerings were a gift or a boon from granted by the king, is no longer prevalent or even real as the centuries move on.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nygaard, and thank all of you for attending today. We really appreciate it at the Carlos Museum and appreciate the support of our members. And I hope that you will all join us tomorrow at noon, I think it's at noon, for a talk by Amitav Ghosh, the great Indian writer, who will be talking about his book on climate change called The Great Derangement. It's a series of essays, and then his response to his own sort of charge in his novel called Gun Island. So that information and how to register for that is on the website. And wishing you all a happy Thanksgiving. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.